All right, welcome to our lecture about how people share space in cities. And this is actually part one of two, so we're going to call it the Core Countries Edition. In other words, we're going to look a lot at mostly North America. The slides are designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Miss Gall. I'll be your host for the lecture, and I'm going to proactively apologize for the amount of text on this PowerPoint, so don't say I didn't warn you. Okay, so we're talking about cities in the global core. There are a few key ideas we kind of need to talk about. We're talking about how cities have been shaped in terms of how space has been shared. So we need to talk about some ideas like redlining. We need to talk about blockbusting, right? And these are ideas that really come out of the Jim Crow era. And Jim Crow is that period from about roughly the 1870s until arguably the 1970s. So it's about a 100-year period that this happens. And it's that period of segregation. So I know you've studied a little bit about it in school, I'm sure. Uh, and segregation, remember, is that separation of people by race within communities. Really, it doesn't matter the size of the community. So the way that that happened is a few different ways. It could happen by law, right? And that's what we see a lot of times in the South, is that there's literally whites and blacks not allowed to live together, not allowed to share services, right? But in the North, it happens, we call it in fact, de facto, right? And the way that it works in the North, and this is where things kind of get a little more interesting, is literally that you've got, for lack of a better term, this collusion between realtors, financial lenders, city governments, homeowners to keep certain spaces all white or all black or all Hispanic or all Asian, okay, within urban environments. And I don't want to, it's not just a white and black thing. I know that's a lot of times what we study, but you see the exact same phenomenon occurring with other ethnic groups as well. And really, we could talk about it even with certain ethnic groups that we now consider to be white. Okay, so really what they're doing is, and this is where we're going to start to get into some of the vocabulary, right? The banks are doing what's called redlining. And redlining really is a fancy schmancy way of saying what they're doing is they're taking the map and they're drawing red lines around certain neighborhoods, and they're saying we won't lend to these people if they try to live in that neighborhood. Okay, so that's part one of redlining. Part two of redlining is these people that live in this poor neighborhood, we're not going to lend to them because they essentially we don't like them, but because they don't have the credit, because their houses are not as in as good a shape, they're not worth as much, but we're not going to give them the money that they need to improve that. Okay, so that's what redlining is. The easy way to think of it, I literally mentally picture the map and the people drawing the red lines around it. Okay, so that's what the banks and the financial lenders are doing, and to some degree the city governments, right? The realtors, on the other hand, what they end up doing, and it becomes kind of interesting because they get involved in that redlining piece as well, in the sense of they just refuse to sell to certain people if they want to buy in certain neighborhoods, right? Or to rent to them and the like. It's amazing how quickly things move on and off the market in that case. But you get some greedy realtors who realize there's a ton of money to be made in what's called blockbusting. And here's kind of the way blockbusting works, okay? So let's just pretend we've got a beautiful block, really a beautiful neighborhood that is all white people in the 1950s and 1960s, okay? And we get a realtor who manages to convince one of those people, maybe they have some financial troubles or things like that, they got to get rid of their house in a hurry, I don't know. Fill in the blank with whatever story you want to use. But they convince these people to sell to an African American or Hispanic or Asian person, fill in the blank minority, okay, who is seen as being less desirable to have living in the neighborhood. So once they convince one person to sell, essentially they've busted the block because now the people next to them are worried about property values. they think things are going downhill, so now they're going to start to sell to get out, right? And it's going to kind of spread out until ultimately the whole neighborhood turns over, and what was once maybe a working class white neighborhood or a middle class white neighborhood is now going to be an all or mostly black neighborhood or Hispanic neighborhood, Asian neighborhood. Okay, you get the idea. But there's a lot of money to be made in selling houses, right? Real estate agents typically make a 3% or so commission, which doesn't sound like much until you stop and think about the fact that, for instance, my house I spent $320,000 on. So a 3% commission of $320,000 is almost $10,000 for one house. So you can see why this would make why it would create an incentive for real estate agents to bust up blocks and convince people to move. And what that ultimately leads to is what's called white flight. And what white flight is it's the movement of whites out of the city and out of those neighborhoods in the city into the adjacent neighborhoods or outlying suburbs, right? And that the reason why this is bad is because by and large, especially when we're talking about, that time period from say 1870 to 1970, is we're talking about the folks who actually have money, who can pay into the tax base, right? And things like that. And so it ends up being very, very bad for cities, largely because you've got people coming in from the suburbs as they're driving on the city roads and they're using the city services and things like that. But what they're not doing is paying into the city's tax base. They're not really paying for those services that they're using in the same way. And so it ends up becoming a problem for cities because they get very poor very quickly as a result. So in order to kind of counter this suburbanization trend, what you see is city governments encouraging commercialization in the central business district, gentrification of neighborhoods in and around the central business district. And gentrification is really a fancy schmancy way of saying to get a bunch of better off folks, oftentimes largely white, but better off folks moving in who are going to fix up the buildings, they're going to raise the property values, they're going to really kind of help the city improve its reputation, for lack of a better term, right? So the goal of commercialization is to transform that central business district into an area attractive to residents and tourists, right? Think like the waterfront in Seattle. And gentrification, we're rehabbing houses. Sometimes we're tearing them down, but a lot of times what they're doing is they're fixing them up. So it's kind of a mixed bag, because gentrification ends up, it makes the neighborhood much nicer, but by the same token, by raising property values, you then come across the issue of where sometimes people are priced out of their homes because they can't afford the property taxes on them, right? And then what you see when we're talking about, for instance, in suburbs, is sometimes suburban homes get bought out literally for the land underneath them. And I've actually seen this happen sometimes in my neighborhood where somebody will buy a house to tear it down. And the idea is we're going to tear it down and we're going to replace it with a much bigger house than what the lot is really designed for. And so kind of the name for those kind of houses, or those, if you've ever been in one of those neighborhoods where every house looks alike, right, or they're all painted similar shades and things like that, call them McMansions. It's kind of a derogatory name for it, but McMansions after McDonald's. Okay. So ultimately, and this is a big problem in the West Coast, what we see is urban sprawl, right? And sprawl comes from that unrestricted growth of housing, commercial developments, roads over large expanses of land. And there's not necessarily a ton of urban planning that goes on with sprawl. And that it's a big deal on the West Coast, largely because we're more reliant on cars. Okay, so cars enable sprawl in a way that if you've got a ton of people who don't have cars and so they're forced into public transportation, a way that doesn't, because public transportation takes longer to get from A to B, and oftentimes it's less reliable. Not that public transportation is unreliable. I love public transportation, but I can't just pick up and go if I want to catch the bus. I got to plan out my route. I got to, allot time for the bus to get there and things like that. So it can create some problems. to kind of counter that idea of sprawl, what we've got is this group of folks who create a vision and what they call is new urbanism, but it's really the development, urban revitalization, suburban reforms. The goal is to create walkable neighborhoods with a diversity of housing and jobs so that people are living closer into kind of central areas and they're not spreading as far out, right? Folks who don't like this argue that it's kind of a spatial determinism, right? Think back to Unit 1, we talked about environmental determinism. It's that same idea, only think about it just in terms of space, okay? Doesn't recognize that fundamental difficulty that with modernism, which is its persistent habit of privileging spatial forms over social processes. In other words, it looks at what can we do with the space, but it doesn't stop and think about really how do we use the space, right? How do people work together to create common space? And so some of the other critics say things like, for instance, the types of communities that new urbanists form are exclusionary, that they deepen racial segregation, and a large piece of that is because poorer folks can't buy into them because it's too expensive, and poorer folks in general tend to be ethnic minorities. And again, I'm speaking in some generalities here. So, for instance, we're talking about that new urbanism, we talk about things like gated communities, right? And a gated community, as the name implies, is literally a fenced-in neighborhood that controls access with gates, with fences for people and automobiles. And the idea behind this is to create kind of a sanctuary, a safe space in a very uncertain urban world. And we start to see these spring up in the 1980s, 1990s, when crime is kind of at its highest, right? And the secondary objective is to maintain housing values by using homeowners associations to enforce certain maintenance requirements. So for instance, your lawn can be no longer than a certain length. I actually literally have a friend whose HOA goes around and measures their lawn, right? You can only put certain types of plants in. My dad, for instance, with his HOA, he can only paint his house certain colors, and he literally got in trouble because even though he picked a color on their palette, he didn't run it past them first, right? And a lot of people fear that what this really does is creates a new type of segregation. Pardon me. So a lot of that's mostly North America. We talk about Europe, we talk about ethnic neighborhoods in European cities. What we tend to see is that those ethnic neighborhoods are people who were former colonies. There tends to be peopled by people from former colonies, if that makes sense. So European governments constrain migration by and large, a large degree, using government policies and laws. Another thing to consider when we talk about European cities is that they tend to be more compact, they're more densely populated, they're more walkable than American cities because they were, by and large, grew up pre-automobile, okay? And then housing in European cities is often combined with places of work. So you might see shops on the ground floor with apartments up above. That's a very common thing to find in European cities. When we talk about housing policy, right? Oftentimes public housing in ethnic neighborhoods in European cities depends on the government policy. So for instance, in Brussels, Belgium, there's very little public housing. Immigrants tend to live in privately owned rentals spread throughout the city. Amsterdam, on the other hand, in the Netherlands, has a great deal of public housing and very few ethnic neighborhoods within public housing units. In other words, they try to kind of spread people out. So that was our lecture about how people in the core kind of share urban space. We talked about a little bit about redlining, we talked about blockbusting, we talked about suburbs and new urbanism, and also talked a little bit about European cities. And if I seem like I'm trying to wrap this up quickly, I am, because my counter is telling me I only have about 30 seconds left. So you get the idea. If you have any questions, if there's anything more you want to know, by all means, please feel free to come in and see me, and I'd be delighted to hear from you and answer any questions you have.